My name is Anna. I am 10 years old and I live with my parents and my little brothers and sisters. At 6 a.m., I wake up and prepare breakfast, and then I accompany my dad to his job. When I come back, I help my mom hang the clothes and bathe my brothers and sisters. Before the pandemic, I went to school every day. I loved drawing and I dreamed of being an architect. My teacher would read me many books. At school, they would give me lunch, and especially I played and had fun with my friends. But in March 2020, my life changed. The doors of my school closed, and I stopped seeing my classmates. The virtual classes started, remote homework, but in my house, we had no internet reception, or computers, or a space to study. My mother had to quit her job to take care of us. I want to go back to school to see my friends and have a better future for me, for my family, and for my country. Making up for the lost time and ensuring learning is a priority for all. With the story of Anna that symbolizes the story of millions of children in our region, we now begin this forum to show our commitment for educational recovery. Good morning and welcome. This is a political and financial commitment promoted by the World Bank in alliance with UNESCO, UNICEF, and the Inter-American Dialogue. Its purpose is to tackle the most important crisis in the history of our region regarding education. During the pandemic, millions of Latin American students had to endure one of the longest periods of schools being shut down. This has had severe consequences on their lives. Schools have reopened their doors, but the crisis persists, including, among other reasons, dropout rates. We will hear the testimonies and the expectations of their students, their families, and educators upon returning to the classroom. And we will have a panel of experts that will discuss how to emerge this crisis. We will hear a commitment with 4 points for educational recovery, with a call for action and for urgent implementation. To conclude, we will hear the heads of state of the region expressing their support to the education of children and young people in the continent. We will hear from these experts. I'm Josefina Townsend, and I will be sharing this event with you, which is being broadcasted in the websites of the organizing entities and the World Bank. It also has interpretation into French, English, Portuguese, and Spanish. We invite you to participate in this dialogue through Twitter of the host organizations. The hashtag is #MyEducationOurFuture. To begin with the interventions of this forum, let's hear Claudia Uribe, Regional Director for Latin America and the Caribbean of the United Nations Organization for Education, Science, and Culture, UNESCO. Claudia will be speaking on behalf of the 4 organizations promoting the commitment for educational recovery. Claudia, good morning and welcome. Good morning. On behalf of the World Bank, of the Inter-American Dialogue, UNESCO, and UNICEF, it is a pleasure to announce our partnership and our commitment to educational recovery in Latin America and the Caribbean. We urge all governments and society as a whole to join us. COVID-19 has brought about the most important educational crisis in our known history, with strong repercussions in our region. The region had already an outstanding debt with education before the pandemic. The partial or total shutting down of schools, which covered 2 full school cycles, affected about 170 million children and teenagers. Despite the major efforts made by the governments to offer educational alternatives that were not in person, its scope was very different based on the challenges faced by the region in terms of connectivity, of multidimensional poverty, and other social conditions and vulnerabilities that affect a large percentage of the population. We have accumulated evidence in our organizations, and we're already seeing signs of the deepening of existing educational gaps and a significant delay in learning, and also deterioration of the socio-emotional well-being and the health of the students. The losses caused in learning and the increase in dropout rates are a major threat for education in the continent. That is why we are urging governments and society as a whole to reinforce their resources to recover and transform education by committing to implementing the necessary actions to avoid dropout and recover those lessons and those learnings in every classroom. This all with concepts of equity and justice by prioritizing the groups that were most affected and those who are particularly vulnerable or excluded. We must make a commitment to educational recovery. Let us take every measure that we can to move forward, and let's contribute from our scope of action. World Bank, UNICEF, and the Inter-American Dialogue are making available all resources, knowledge, and will to achieve this. Thank you very much. Claudia, thank you very much. Let's now begin to hear the voices of those who have been most affected by the effects of the pandemic in education. Before the pandemic, countries in Latin America and the Caribbean already were suffering from an educational crisis. Only 1/3 of the students had the basic skills upon completing primary school. Also, about 10.5 million of them were outside the school system. With the onset of COVID-19, learning became a challenge. The first day after the pandemic was declared, it was really like a very big hit on the educational system. With the pandemic, the virtual classes started and we didn't have any reception or money to put an internet connection and study.
It burned my heart to know them sitting at home, can't go to school.
It was really complicated to purchase devices that we didn't have at home so that they could connect. Virtual classes, if we had a question and the teacher didn't see us or couldn't hear us, well, we were just left wondering. I started becoming sad. It really became like hell. Despite the efforts of authorities and teachers, students missed out on an average of 1.5 years of learning. Dear students, I'm learning at home. The level of learning is minimum. I would say that it's just basic learning. With respect to the emotional aspect, my children would listen to what the teacher said and then they tried to interpret it or try to see how they could actually learn it. With the pandemic, it already affected our economy. It wasn't enough to continue providing Margarita with the possibility of studying. Now, most of the schools have reopened their doors, but the learning problems persist. To bring back children and teenagers from their homes to the classroom, we have had to work hard, both teachers and the schools. Now we find ourselves working to achieve a situation where the kids can adapt to in-person classes. There were kids who had forgotten how to multiply, knowing that they were between 14 and 18 years old. So this is a big delay in education. After 2 years, we are realizing what their reaction was like. It has provided some information on how these kids, for example, who were introvert or scared, how little chance they had to interact also with their peers. I want to go back to school because it is important and we must value this because that's the only way to move forward. Millions of students in Latin America and the Caribbean could drop out of school. Catching up the lost time is a priority for all. Most of schools in the region have opened their doors. Now the challenge is to ensure that all the students return to the classroom and to recover the lost learning. To recover uh, from the impact of this crisis, we will have a panel with experts with Abel Fisbain from the Inter-American Dialogue. He will be moderating the conversation. Let me give the floor to Ariel. Ariel, good morning.
I have the great pleasure of being able to talk with three experts in education in this region about the impact that the pandemic has had on the educational system and on education. Particularly, let me introduce them. Emanuela Di Gropelo, she's education manager for Latin America and the Caribbean at the World Bank. Carlos Enrique, he's the coordinator of the Latin American Laboratory for Assessment of Quality of Education of UNESCO. And Italo Dutra, he's the Education Regional Advisor for UNICEF. So I think that we have a wonderful panel to talk about a critical topic. And to begin with the most elementary part, we would like to understand what are the effects that the closure of schools for so many months in Latin America, which, as you know, this has been the region in the world where this closure has been the longest. So, what was the effect on education and on learning? Carlos, maybe you could give us your view on this aspect first. Thank you very much, Ariel, for your invitation and for being able to talk from UNESCO and our lab on this crusade on learning. Let me tell you that the foundations in our region prior to the pandemic were already weak. In the ERSA study, the last large scale study conducted by the end of that year indicates that students are learning very little. And except for some specific exceptions, the region is not moving forward from 2013 to 2019. So that gives us a diagnosis even prior to the critical point of the pandemic, which turns out to be quite complex for the well being and learning of our students. 4 out of 10 children have the lowest performance in the third grade of elementary school. So this means that in a language, they cannot identify an information in a simple paragraph. If we tell that child to identify that, he or she is unable to do that. In maths, the same thing happens. 1 out of 2 also have low performance, and they are not even able to break down numbers up to 9,999, do basic exercises of adding or subtracting. Of course, these are exercises that our students are unable to do. So that's why the ERSA study gives us information and added to what other institutions indicate of the impact of the effects of the pandemic is so critical and requires an alliance in order to have a recovery first for the students' learning. Second, because they are quite unequal. Third, because there is a very important number or group, over 50%, that is really lagging behind. On the other hand, this demands specific support for students and for teachers in order to reverse this lack of opportunities that in the commitment of the 2030 agenda and the commitment that we all want students to learn, of course, we're really very far away from that. And school attendance prior to the pandemic marked a difference between those who attended classes and those who didn't. And also, repetition indicates that we need to see how much they are learning beforehand, because those sorts of instruments ultimately seems not an adequate measure. In fact, we need to look what's their performance prior to everything else. Very clear. Manuela, what are your thoughts? Well, thank you very much, Ariel. It's a pleasure to be here on behalf of the World Bank and be able to share some things about the impact that the pandemic has had on the educational system in the region. And let me also, first of all, tell you that in fact, the World Bank, UNESCO, UNICEF, and the Dialogue will launch in 2 or 3 weeks a new joint study that will give more details on the specific impact, the serious impact that the pandemic has had on the sector. So I'm going to use these 2 minutes to share with you some preliminary items. We are very much concerned about the impact that the impact has had. Maybe three main things. First of all, while schools have been closed, what we've observed is that the access and the quality of education, remote education, have been quite problematic in the region, particularly in some countries and specifically with some populational groups. Second, this has led to a reduction in attendance while schools were closed, with a group of students that were absolutely disconnected. We still don't have any updated data on dropout, on the proportion of students that have dropped out school. But some preliminary information that we have are already showing that the dropout has increased, and specifically, it's done so between 6 and 14 years of age. But specifically, there is a risk of future dropout, which is quite strong. This dropout risk is also related specifically to the third item I'm going to mention now, which is loss of learning. Carlos has already mentioned that Latin America was undergoing a learning crisis prior to the pandemic. So the situation was already concerning. What the data and our simulations that have been updated already show us is that learning will get worse. When we observe, for instance, the years of schooling corrected by learning, we see that depending on countries, students have lost between 1 and 1.8 years adjusted by learning, and this is really a lot. If we see the tests that were mentioned by Carlos before, on average, we could see an over 40 percentage point reduction. And this number really has an impact, because this means that the proportion of elementary school children that won't be able to read and interpret a text accordingly to their age will increase disproportionately. And the study will produce all of this data in more detail. So again, we are really very much concerned about an increase of this deficiency in learning. And let me conclude by saying that this is already being observed in the current data of some countries. When we observe the impact assessment, we see that these reductions occur between 9 and 20%. And ultimately, this reduction in learning are occurring mostly in more vulnerable states. And this is also something that we should pay attention to because there is enormous potential for inequalities to continue to increase. I will stop here in this diagnosis and we can continue with the conversation later on. Thank you, Emanuela. And to complete this outlook, we heard also about some effects in what has to do with well-being and social emotional well-being for students and teachers. So, Italu, what are you experiencing in this regard? Sometimes we forget about it. Yes, well, first of all, let me thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be here with all of you. And in fact, the data that were just mentioned by Emanuela, in those data, we also have some things that have to do with inequality that affect children and adolescents in different ways in our region. An important matter is that these aspects of the pandemic within the educational sector are not effects that can be immediately measured. Why? Well, for a series of measures that have been taken by countries of maintaining the tuitions or the registrations, of doing everything they could in order to offer some kind of remote modality. But prior to the pandemic, as Carlos also mentioned, and Emmanuel as well, we already had a situation of inequality in the region that was really brutal. So, with the pandemic, uh, we bet on a remote education, mostly in most countries invested in some kind of TV broadcast or some others radio broadcast. Also, the use of WhatsApp was quite important during this situation. And we forgot about the face to face, the necessary interaction between children, especially younger children. And there's also a study mentioned by Emanuela. These were those who most suffer. And of course, this also affects mental health and it brings about consequences that we have not yet measured in the long run. But right now, we have cases of violence that are being reported in different countries. We were able to observe internal violence cases and also cases of violence against children. So this is a problem. School, which should be a place to shelter, of course, is immersed in society, and therefore we do experience some cases of weakness and mental problems and violence that are being reported in our region. Well, that is a very serious concern because, in general, we're not prepared to deal with that in schools. And this is a fact. We're not prepared. And teachers and headmasters and mistresses are not really prepared for that. And of course, we need to work further on that. And of course, we need to prioritize the curriculum, also an active search of children who are not coming back to schools. We do have some anecdotic reports that this is also a problem. We might not have updated data, but maybe in the next 2 years, we'll see what the consequences will be like in the midterm. But that is also a problem. And besides, we are not really prepared in order to face everything related to mental health of children and teenagers, and also everything related to violence during childhood. So this is a concern that goes beyond the educational sector. Of course, we have some social protection sectors that were quite affected, not only due to the lockdown of services, but also because budgets are going down, everything that's related to education and also within social protection service. So this is a big concern for us. So yes, really very worrying all this outlook. And of course, this year, countries have already reopened the services, and we know that this is underway and we are still learning every day. But I would like to ask Carlos about the difficulties and what can you say about difficulties in this reopening? I know you have data prior to the pandemic and you might give us some hints about the main problems, right?
Yes, Ariel, with the yes and with the participating countries, we've had to face many, many challenges and difficulties, as Emanuela has described as well, and Italo also pointed out, in the sense of all of the implications that this has for the families, for the students, etc. This involves infrastructure, technology, the contact with the students, and the resources to finally be able to generate a connection. This involves contact to know how the students are doing and how their families are doing, and also to provide psychosocial support when it comes to learning. Nowadays, educational systems are uh, facing many challenges based on the data that we are collecting. And everything has to do with mental health, with the coexistence of students, with students actually spending time together. We have disruptive attitudes that maybe they don't know how to interact with other peers, how to share their things, etc. All of this requires support. Italo mentioned this very well. The school community sometimes is not prepared and they require support, both the students and the teachers. Secondly, there are difficulties to be able to face the activation of learning in one same class. In one same class, we can have students who have learned how to read, students who are lagging 6 months, lagging behind by 6 months, and some they don't even have the basic requirements to understand how to read. So there is greater diversity, and this puts more pressure on teachers and requires more specific support, so that what will happen between today and the end of the year will have an actual impact. This is why it is necessary to know exactly where the students are in that line of learning. There is also the issue of the rekindling or the reconnection of those students that are returning to school. How can we face the dropout rates, and how can we have maybe an early warning system to go after and look for those students and bring them back and help them solve their difficulties? Finally, one of the issues in which we have moved forward with the pandemic, and which has to do with distance learning, to not return to certain things that didn't work in the past, but to really focus on new pedagogical approaches so that learning can actually occur. This, of course, combined with good technological infrastructure so that we can provide a safe environment for learning. All of these challenges imposes more difficulties and requires more efforts and more support for those education centers. A lot of strength and strong support has to go to these schools, because they are the hubs of learning, and students need to be the focus. This needs to be student-centered by rechanneling all of the support in this direction. This is what we believe at UNESCO. There is a clear and strong need to support schools. This requires, of course, capacity building, financing, and resources, and a partnership, so that this scenario that has proven so complex, because it's not just about learning, it's really the whole ensemble of well-being of our kids. This requires of a strong alliance, so that those people who are in the schools can receive the support so that the school is not just a place for learning, but a place for well-being and, of course, overall learning. I would like to ask you specifically about something that was mentioned and maybe ask Italo, how worried are you at UNICEF? How concerned are you at UNICEF with dropout, with attendance rates, with the lack of participation that may result? I know that things are sort of being dealt with in the different countries, and I would like to know your opinion. We have a situation here in the region in general, which is that we're still analyzing the data to see what has actually happened with the decisions that were made and the policies that were implemented. Before the pandemic, the trend was a reduction of the number of kids per school. It was a slow reduction in the last 2 decades, but it was a downward trend. What happened with the pandemic is that we offered alternative options for distance learning, for remote learning, or as it is called in the region. But that remote attendance is not reaching the same quality and not arriving with the same quality at the different recipients. And of course, everything is different. Particularly, and here I would like to go back to the data that Emanuela mentioned of the study that we're about to launch, particularly in younger kids. What happens with a child that is starting to read and write after a year of remote classes? We have empirical data that shows that there has been long-term impact in the learning process of the teenagers in the region. And of course, this has an impact in the short term, in the medium term, when it comes to lagging behind in schools and when it comes to learning. A child that was moving from third grade and automatically finds himself or herself in fifth grade might lack certain basic skills. And we can talk about literacy in the early stages of schools, but also other problems that occur at a later age when they should have completed their literacy but haven't. So there are a series of additional factors that will exercise pressure on the dropout rates. We do not have the data yet to say, okay, we have this trend or another trend, but we have identified a series of concerns that show that we will have probably a high level of exams that are not passed at the end of the year, and that they might repeat the year. Repeating the year is definitely not a good strategy. We have seen that through the data, but also we cannot allow everyone to pass to the next level if they haven't acquired certain skills. So this brings us to a situation with a lot of pressure on the system because of the risk of dropout. And the data needs to be analyzed to paint a clear picture on what will happen. And I think the concern is that the trends, of course, have to do with the economic impacts of the pandemic. It has to do with the fact that the quality of the remote education during the pandemic was challenging. And of course, the fact that we have a region with an entire generation that has lost a tremendous amount of hours of learning, missed opportunities for learning. And of course, we have a situation where an immediate action is required, and it's emergent. It's an emergency. Yes, we are already in an emergency mode with the learning. We were already in emergency mode before the pandemic, actually, but now the evidence is showing that we need to act strongly because there is a very clear impact on dropout, on, of course, lagging behind, and, of course, the learning process that will affect an entire generation. Following up on this last point, Emanuela, what can we say about the long-term effects, not only on education, but also on the economy of the country, the income levels, the productivity? What can we say about that? Ariel, I think that there are serious concerns in that regard as well. We have discussed the fact that, of course, we do not have all of the impacts already identified, but there are a lot of warning signs and areas of concern. Of course, that missing these years of education has a clear implication and consequence. We are already seeing that young kids who are in school now will have lost more than 10% of their income, of their annual income throughout their life. We are talking about an impact that is equal to more than 10% of their annual income. This is remarkable and actually indicates that the quality of life and the possibilities of employment for these young kids is at risk. In addition to the loss of learning, which is having a strong impact in the competencies required for the labor market in general. And there is, of course, a lack of basic knowledge involved, but also more cross-cutting competencies, the ability to solve problems, the ability to communicate, the leadership abilities. We have seen that the pandemic not only has had an impact regarding basic skills, but also what we call cross-cutting skills or competencies. So we really will have people who will arrive in the labor market with less preparation, and this will have implications regarding unemployment and productivity in the long term. I would also like to point out the fact that inequality needs to be considered because access to distance education was much more challenging for the more disadvantaged populations and the most vulnerable segments. The reduction in learning simulations and data in countries that already have this data are showing that the most vulnerable groups have been more affected. And the consequence of this is that those who are most vulnerable will be suffering the consequences in the long term in their life regarding the labor market. So we are expecting a significant increase in inequality. And this is a region where there was chronic inequality already, and this has been intensified. So Carlos might want to discuss more this issue, but this is a bit what I wanted to mention. Of course, we have talked about reopening the schools and everything that the support that needs to be implemented and that schools need to be reopened in full. This is of great concern because kids need to go back to school, and we also need to implement policies so that they do not drop out of school. We have discussed this extensively. For example, early warning systems, social protection systems, etc. All of this needs to point towards retaining those kids in school. Another necessary thing to avoid dropout is, of course, recovering and catching up that learning. There is really no time to waste. We have three fundamental points here. Measuring, knowing where the kids are and where they are not. With the reopening of the schools, countries have the possibility of doing this with summative and formative assessments. simplify the curriculums and focusing on the fundamental aspects such as cross-cutting skills, math, reading, and writing. We will not be able to catch up on everything, but this is what is necessary. And we need to implement programs and strategies to catch up what has been lost so that these kids, these young kids, can start recovering and even expedite their learning process. The focus needs to be to teaching at the right level. Carlos has already described how there were such differences in one same classroom, and now we will see that inequality even further in the classroom. And this is a very large scale problem. So strategies will need to be designed to design programs to teach at the right level. I'm sorry that this is taking a little longer, but if we go back to the labor market, we are facing numerous risks which have to do with long-term impact, and this involves entire countries. This involves a loss of income, and it can really cover entire countries. So there's no time to lose, really.
Emanuela, we're running out of time, but I would not like to finish with such a negative remark. So I would like to ask you very briefly to tell me something that has happened prior to these 2 years that might give you some hope, some optimism, because also we've been having some positive things. So, very briefly, something that gives us hope, Emanuela? Yes, Ariel, thank you. And I think it's also important, of course, in each crisis, we have lots of lessons that we can learn. Probably I could mention many, but let me just mention one. For instance, the use of technology and the use of data during the pandemic, during the schools closure. I believe that, of course, we've highlighted some lacks and some deficiencies, but there have been many opportunities to move forward from the technological point of view in the use of data. And this can also be very useful towards the future. So, three things: we have the opportunity to really improve information systems in the region and also monitoring and assessment in order to make faster decisions, more effective decisions. We also have the possibility of using technology in order to design learning systems that are at the proper level, but we also have the opportunity to continue to use in those remote and hybrid systems in order to reach other populations, further populations, and also increase the quality of population to extend the school day. We do have many opportunities ahead, of course, and we need to use them towards a better future. Italo, one thing that gives you high hopes? Well, I think that many of them have already been mentioned by Emanuela, but I do believe that we live in a region where that is not really used to using data in order to make decisions. I think that we've started to improve data monitoring in the region during the pandemic at a national and subnational levels. We still need to make that leap to go to the next step. So, something that really encourages me during this process is also seeing that we do have innovative solutions for the emergency mode. And let me highlight this, as Manuela said, we cannot wait. We are already lagging behind in large scale actions for learning recovery. And we do have some local solutions. We need to give it the visibility, the budget, and also the necessary urgency on the part of the government and on the part of society itself, and of course on the part of educational systems. But we do have interesting solutions, as Emanuela said, hybrid solutions, some solutions in order to level of the education, and also some learning recovery programs for children that are dropping out. We do have very low levels of secondary school completion. And we also have flexible modalities and alternatives that have emerged during the pandemic that can also be used. And we can take it as a lesson learned and move towards learning recovery, which is really urgent. It's for right now. We do have the means to do this. We do have the intelligence and capability in the region, but we need to give it the visibility that is needed. Thank you. Same question for Carlos. Just a positive message. Well, in view of so much complexity, I think that there are really very good news. I think that teachers' cooperation, autonomy, looking that's the grade or the mark and uh, pay more attention to learning process. I think that this is a very good conversation in order to use information to focus on learning, to have specific tutorship to different children. I think that this is a challenge, is a demand, but also help us to help children move in a competent manner. And regarding the educational system, of course, the social emotional skill as a part and parcel of the education that we need for our children. Language and maths, of course, is really very important. It will enable us to know how to learn. But we also need students that are empathetic with others, that respect themselves, that are perseverant, that have self control. I think that this is the good news together with what my colleague says. We should prioritize learning. We should prioritize the content. I think that we do have good news and will help us in this alliance. Well, let me thank the three of you very much. I hope we had more time to continue talking. And I know that very soon we will be together again in order to introduce the report Emanuela already mentioned. So we will continue with this conversation. See you then. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ariel, and also thank you very much to all the panelists. Before I introduce the commitment for the recovery of learning, let's take a look at the future vision of children and youth in Latin America and the Caribbean. It is time to take urgent measures to settle the historical crisis of education in Latin America and the Caribbean. After 2 years of a pandemic, I feel proud of having returned to school. Let's say that school today is an essential part of who I am.
I want to get my education.
Well, I was only able to finish primary school. And for my daughter, I want her to finish all of her studies. What they want and what you leave them with is education. When I finish school, I want to continue studying at a university because I want to help my family. What I like the most about classes is the possibility of receiving an education and therefore know more and have a better future ahead of me. I will achieve this. I will be someone in this life. There is no time to waste. The educational crisis is far from over. It's just become less visible. Not all students have returned to the classroom, and millions of them have lost a lot in terms of learning, and now they're at risk of dropping out of school. We urge governments and international organizations, as well as the citizenship, to renew their commitment both politically and financially and implement concrete actions to avoid this intergenerational catastrophe. These are the 4 commitments. First commitment, place educational recovery at the top of the list in our agendas. Second commitment, reintegrate students who have dropped out of school and ensure that they stay in school. Third commitment, recover learning and ensure social emotional well-being for children and young people. Fourth commitment, value supporting and training teachers. These are the commitments of educational recovery. This is a public document that you can access in full by clicking on the QR code that appears on the screen. Please share it so that our voices and the voice of our students is heard in Latin America and the Caribbean. Carlos Felipe Jaramillo, Vice President of the World Bank for Latin America and the Caribbean, will kick off this final segment where we will hear the testimony of the heads of state of our region. Carlos Felipe, good morning. Go ahead. Thank you for supporting us today in the presentation of the Declaration of Commitments for the Recovery of Learning in Latin America and the Caribbean. The World Bank supports this call for action because we urgently need decisive action to build a better future for the more than 170 million students who, in our region, were affected in different ways by the effects of the pandemic. Our region, Latin America and the Caribbean, is undergoing one of the most severe educational crises in the last century. The pandemic triggered an increase in poverty and inequality and a massive closing down of schools. This has brought about catastrophic consequences for the educational systems that were already in a crisis before the pandemic. Today, by starting this path towards recovery, it is paramount to invest in the reconstruction of human capital. Responding to this unprecedented educational crisis requires not only the support of governments, but also the private sector, multilateral organizations, and society as a whole. That is why we are here today. Thank you very much to Presidents Gabriel Boric from Chile, Xiomara Castro from Honduras, Alberto Fernandez from Argentina, and Guillermo Lasso from Ecuador. They will now share with us their insights on this challenge. Carlos Felipe, thank you very much. We will now hear from Gabriel Boric, President of Chile. The pandemic has undoubtedly been very difficult for the school community in Chile and across Latin America. That is why, in our country, we are deeply concerned about not continuing with the logic of standardized tests that seek to actually test knowledge, which at the end of the day is not useful for our children. What we want nowadays is for us to live together and meet again and to bridge that enormous educational gap that already existed, but that the pandemic made even bigger. That's why we've created programs such as the life skills programs focusing on mental health and improving the infrastructure of our schools. We have developed programs to improve the experience in schools, and we are concerned about maintaining schools open as long as possible because we know that that's where we can meet again as a society, the place where we can understand each other as equals. That is our call from Chile to all of Latin America. We are willing to work together with other countries to move forward and put our society back together again, a society that has been fractured by inequality during the pandemic. Warm greetings from Chile. Thank you very much, President Boric. Now let's hear from the President of Honduras, Xiomara Castro. Your Excellencies, President of our fellow countries of the Americas and the world, our greetings in solidarity from Honduras. The right to education has been affected by the application of neoliberal policies. The health emergency revealed that neoliberalism fails to recognize the rights of the peoples. They only recognize the needs of the market. We have received a weakened state, weakened by corruption, and where the main catastrophe were the decisions made at a political level and which only increased the level of poverty. The pandemic deepened educational inequalities. This is why one of my first decisions was to ensure that each and every student had access to free, high quality education. My government has decided to pay special attention to investment in education by increasing 10% of its budget, even though there were austerity measures as well. During my first 100 days of government, almost 1 million children were vaccinated between the ages of 5 and 11. We reopened free schools, and we have also started offering educational activities in more than 70% of the educational centers at a national level. During the 4 years of my government, we will support the reconstruction of educational centers by supporting projects that provide safety measures and water through community participation mechanisms. Once the infrastructure has been strengthened, it will be further enhanced over time. We will build new classrooms, new schools in priority areas. It is key to invest in more and better education by making transparent public procurement and by public tenders, and also by establishing educational budgets to achieve better results. We will help our teachers obtain technological training, and we will focus on the national integration of culturally relevant practices under the principles of social justice, sovereignty, and democracy, in keeping with the Morisanic thinking. The idea is to promote memory and to promote the respect for our history. The Minister of Education will follow specific instructions to reach the educational goals by implementing national, municipal, and classroom evaluations because we must prioritize basic skills. We have reactivated the Merienda Escolar program to reduce the malnutrition of millions of children. Furthermore, we have worked to provide scholarships for 20,000 young children with low income at all levels, primary, secondary school, and higher education, dedicating many resources to that. If we have learned something from neoliberalism and during the health emergency, is that we must strengthen institutions and the educational systems in order to overcome unpredictable challenges. Resilience means providing people, institutions, and communities with the ability to respond to these challenges in order to prosper and to thrive socially and financially. Peoples of the world, we ratify the Morisanic fraternal concept. This must be present in our historical moment right now, where we are fighting for better education to strengthen our awareness as peoples. And let me share a statement of Jose Francisco Morazán Quesada. The people's education is the premise of a free nation to prepare for the triumph of reason and freedom. Thank you very much. Now, let's hear from Argentina, President Alberto Fernandez. The world has undoubtedly entered a very unique phase with the advance of technology and science. Knowledge has become the wealth of a society. The richest societies nowadays are not those that have oil and gas or gold. The richest societies today are those that have been able to develop knowledge. Knowledge for the future of a society. You may have mineral resources in your land, but if you do not have the technology to extract them adequately, those resources are worth nothing. In conclusion, paying attention to knowledge in our current times is essential. And paying attention to that first knowledge, which is basic education, the education that the state must provide to the citizens. Argentina has a history with the development of public education. This started in the 19th century with men such as Sarmiento or Alberdi, who saw in public education a mechanism of social progress. Afterwards, we were able to build an open university, a university that was plural. And in the 50s, Perón finally was able to secure free higher education. This allowed the sons and daughters of workers to access higher education. Every day, the world requires more and more education and more knowledge. In times such as our current times, where the pandemic has forced us to confine ourselves and made us lose that time where we shared within the context of education, makes us double our efforts for more knowledge and more learning to ensure a better future. More access to public education to ensure that everyone can develop their full potential. This is the true challenge of a moment in history where the pandemic has taken the lives of millions and millions of people. Thank you very much, President Fernandez. From Ecuador, let's hear from Guillermo Lasso, who sends us this message. Dear friends, almost 3 months ago, Ecuadorian students started returning to in-person classes, reaching 100% of the school's capacity after 2 years of a pandemic. The magic of coming together with their classmates, their teachers, the laughter, the games, and the joy of learning were the main ingredients of this return to the classroom. This return was highly anticipated by millions of children and young people. This is what happened with Michelle Chango, for example, of the educational unit Manuela Chanizares, a prestigious educational center of Quito, the capital of our country. Together with 4.5 million children and teenagers from Ecuador, they are, as we speak, in the classroom. They are studying and they are building their future. They do not need to wear a mask when outdoors. Finally, the restrictions of the pandemic are leaving us, and hopefully this will only be remembered as a nightmare or a bad dream. When I was a student, I had to work to pay for my last years of school and to contribute to my parents' home. These were years that really left a mark in me, and they allowed me to understand the importance of an education that is based on practice, on discipline, and on responsibility. This is why I am moved and I am appalled by the fact that for some years before my administration, Ecuador had to witness the closing down of more than 11,000 schools, particularly in rural areas. We have already reopened more than 100 schools in 12 months of government. At the end of my administration, it will be at least 1,000 schools more. Furthermore, with political will and always thinking about our dear children, we increase the budget for education. Only this year, we are investing more than $150 million in infrastructure for education, and we will invest 650 million more between now and 2025. This is how much the future of millions of young people concerns us. In the same vein, and being aware of the reality of our country and the fact that there cannot be learning if children are not well fed, we have set the goal of reducing child malnutrition by 2025 by about 7 percentage points, from 29% to 22% in children under the age of 2. I would like to conclude these remarks by calling all actors of the civil society and the public sector at a national and international level to come together and really support the rebuilding of education. We invested in education, but with the support of every citizen, we can reach even better results in a shorter period of time. The future of our countries and the well-being of millions of families depends on that. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to all the heads of state for their messages. Now over to you, Carlos Felipe. Thank you very much, Presidents Boric, Castro, Fernandez, and Lasso. You have highlighted key aspects that we have reflected in the declaration. Facing this major challenge means that education must be a priority in the agenda of our countries. As President Boric mentioned, we must take responsibility for the huge educational gap that already existed, but that the pandemic worsened. This involves also reintegrated children that have dropped out of school and ensure that they complete their education. As President Lasso mentioned, there can be no learning if schools do not reopen, all of them. And we consider other issues such as chronic malnutrition, or if we do not increase investment in education significantly. This is probably the most relevant challenge. We must recover that lost learning, and we must ensure the social well-being, social and emotional well-being of those children. Also, the words of Xiomara Castro mentioned that we must analyze the goals of learning by implementing evaluations in the classroom in order to prioritize basic skills. Finally, it is essential to value and to train and support the teachers. As President Fernandez mentioned, every day the world is demanding more education and more knowledge. This challenge forces us to double our efforts. Finally, I would like to emphasize that the crisis we are undergoing is also an opportunity to build back better and not to go back to that previous situation before the pandemic. The idea of building back better after the devastating effects of the pandemic must be supported by facts. Today, more than ever before, education in Latin America and the Caribbean requires concrete actions and a wide, broad-based commitment from multiple sectors, not just to overcome the crisis, but also to prepare future generations and provide them with the tools they need to have a better future and reach their full potential. Thank you very much. Carlos Felipe, thank you very much. Jean Go from the United Nations Fund for Childhood, UNICEF, will join us with the final comments. Jean, go ahead. Your Excellencies, distinguished heads of state of our region, thank you for joining us and for sharing your messages of commitment for the recovery of education in Latin America and the Caribbean. Thank you to all of you for connecting today from the region and from beyond. Your commitment with the children and teenagers is today more critical than ever before. The future of an entire generation in the region depends on the actions that we will take today to ensure the recovery of the learning that was lost during the pandemic. 2 years after the outbreak of COVID-19, many countries have reopened their schools. However, as the experts have warned us today, the educational crisis is far from over. The children and teenagers of Latin America and the Caribbean have experienced one of the periods, the longest periods in history where the schools have been closed. And not everybody has returned to school, especially in the most vulnerable sectors. Those who have returned to the schools, many of them have not been able to catch up for the lost time. The losses are so significant that millions of them are now at risk of dropping out and quitting school. Furthermore, there are many students who continue to be affected by trauma experienced during the pandemic. This affects their well-being and their capacity for learning. This is not about a few students. There are millions of students at risk of lagging behind. If urgent actions are not taken immediately, the loss of collective learning will be detrimental for Latin America and the Caribbean for decades. This will in turn increase inequalities and delaying the process of learning. Small reinforcement programs for a few students will not be sufficient. In order to tackle the educational crisis, we need to implement and develop systems for educational recovery at scale like never before in our region. This involves investments in education, major investments in Latin America and the Caribbean. The challenge ahead is big. But as our speakers have said today, in the face of this big challenge, there is hope. Hope in the solutions to accelerate learning, and these efforts are being implemented in the region and can be applied and adapted at different scales. This includes the use of technology that we have learned to use and better leverage during the pandemic. There is hope in the children and the teenagers of the region, as well as the families and the teachers. We heard their testimony today, and we are convinced that education is key for a better future. In this vein, we also find hope in the messages shared by the heads of state, and we hope they will encourage other countries to follow their example. The children and teenagers of Latin America and the Caribbean cannot overcome this crisis alone. From the World Bank, the UNESCO and UNICEF, we are convinced that international cooperation of the citizens is essential, and the commitment to educational recovery has to take place through concrete actions. This has to do with our future, and we have to invest today and not forget an entire generation, an entire region. It is up to us. In 10 or 20 years, how do we wish to be remembered? As those who failed to manage the most important educational crisis in the history of Latin America and the Caribbean, or as those who, with courage and determination, supported the recovery of education? I grew up in a rural area of Honduras, and I am the result of public education. I wouldn't be here without everything I learned at school. This region needs more qualified people as well as empowered people. And it is now the moment to plant this future in every school, in every classroom, for every child in the region. Thank you very much. Jean, thank you very much, and thank you to all of those who participated in this seminar for educational recovery in our region. This conversation will be available in social media of the World Bank and all of the host organizations. Thank you very much.